Oh, there looks like we're streaming now. Greetings, heroes. It is I, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier, and just connecting all the pipes in the internet here. Just really delighted to be with you today. Yesterday was kind of a thing. It was just some people have been asking, okay, what's your conversion story? I'm always advocating for, okay, if people are interested in converting, here's how you do it. Or here's here's the different steps that you take. Here's what you have to learn. I'm not out there pushing Judaism, like knocking on doors. It is not for everybody. I'm not handing out pamphlets saying, have you heard the good news about Moses, for example? But I do like to open the door for people as the door was held open for me, for people who are already on this journey. And some people had asked what my conversion story was, and I've shared this in sort of drips and drabs in various places I talk about in my book, things like that. But I thought I would do a YouTube live session so people could watch it live and also ask me questions along the way. And I did, and it turns out that it was perhaps the biggest live video that I've ever done in terms of number of people watching at the same time. And it was also far and away the biggest day I've ever had on YouTube in terms of watch time, meaning, the total number of minutes watched times people watching those minutes. And it was bananas. And I was totally unprepared for that. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for asking me to share my story. That's really humbling. And thank you for watching me share my story and for the great questions that you brought during that conversation. So just all in all, thank you for being a part of that. And so a couple people, I ask at the end, I was like, well, that's part of the story. That gets us up to about 20 years ago. But what's happened since? One thing is I've become a rabbi since becoming Jewish. So it was like many, many years later that I decided to become a rabbi. And I asked people, would you like to hear that story too? And many people said, yes, let's hear that story. So here we go. Just so you know, if you're joining us for the first time, I like to go on YouTube Live as a way to do a live studio recording for the Jew Curious Show podcast. And some of the thing, not every single thing is going to make it to the podcast, but some of these episodes I then put into the Jew Curious Show, which is a podcast available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, all the podcast places. So you can check that out. Feel free to peruse that podcast for your listening pleasure, at your listening leisure, and let me know what you think of it. But for what we're going to do right now is we're going to sit down for a bit. If you're looking for like a 90-second YouTube video on how to become a rabbi, this is not it. This is going to be a little bit of a conversation. We're going to be here for a little while, so buckle up. You can always come back to watch the replay later. If you have to tune out, that's cool. If you tune out because you're bored, that's cool too. This isn't for everybody. I'm not for everybody, so I dig. But in any case, what we're going to do is sit back, have a conversation. We're going to record this like I'm recording a podcast, just in case this hits the digital airwaves later. And it goes a little something like this. Hero, have you ever wondered why on earth anybody would want to be a rabbi? Well, I can't speak for anyone, but I can speak for myself. On today's episode, we're going to discuss my personal journey to becoming a rabbi, how I decided to do it, what the process was like applying to seminary, going through rabbinical school, being selected by a community to be their rabbi. And I'll also be answering your questions live right after this bass. Take a little silence print here while the air conditioner is running. Thank you, Ron Snow, for that delightful introduction. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and the Hadar Ensemble, for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you to the live studio audience who has tuned in today to hear my story and ask your questions about it. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. This is a podcast for Jew curious people of all kinds. Maybe you were born Jewish, but you're still curious about some aspects of the tradition. Maybe you weren't born Jewish, but you've been thinking about Judaism for a while, considering converting, and you're somewhere on that path. Maybe you're devoted to an entirely different religion, but you're curious about the Jewish roots of your own faith. Or maybe you're just a spiritual seeker trying on a few different things to see which one is right for you. In any case, hero, you are welcome to join us for this part of your journey as we explore how Jewish wisdom and Jewish traditions and Jewish people can help you live a life of greater meaning, joy, human connection, and personal growth. I want to take a moment to give some shout outs to our live studio audience today. Let's see who's joining us. We got Trig Bell. Welcome, Trig. Nice to see you. Val is listening while she's driving. Nice to see you as well, Val. Karen from suburban Philadelphia has come back to join us today, and Kathy from SoCal, beautiful sunny Southern California. Nice to see Carla J from Arcadia. Welcome, Carla. CJ Mays says, hola, everyone. Hola, CJ. Nice to see Curtis Brown with us today. And Kathy says, minion made, Rabbi. That means we've got at least 10 people watching right now. So happy to have all of you here with us. Real quick, if anybody listening to this show right now would like to participate in a future live studio recording, all you have to do is go to YouTube, that is youtube.com, and then search for me, search for Rabbi John with an H, John, Carrier, Carrier, just like the big boat that holds airplanes. And if you do, you'll see all the live sessions that I've got scheduled in the near future. Pick a topic you're interested in, or just come to one of our Ask Me Anything sessions. That's fine too. I also like to teach about the Torah portion of the week here, if you have any questions about that. And feel free to join us for a live session in which you can be one of the peeps that I give props to, as well as ask your questions. And if you do, I think that's the most generous thing that you can do, is show up live and ask what questions you have about the topic at hand. Because, hero, I firmly believe that if you have those questions, other people just like you have those questions. And if you ask and I answer, you're helping not just yourself, but other Jew-curious people as well. And before we begin with today's admittedly personal topic for me, I'd like to acknowledge that this show is made possible by the Jew Curious School. The Jew Curious School is a private online portal of Jewish learning. If you are interested in Judaism, in Jewish wisdom, in Jewish holidays, traditions, rituals, people, and things, but perhaps you don't live close to a synagogue, or you don't have a connection with a rabbi who gets you, then I'd like to suggest you check out the Jew Curious School. This is a place where people just like you get together. We have 3 live classes a week, as well as an active community forum. That's my favorite part, is the community forum, where Jew Curious people just like you get together to share their stories, share their journey, their struggles, and also share support with one another, and occasional recipes, book recommendations, and my favorite, jokes. If this sounds like something you might be interested in, then check us out at jewcurious.school/info. Just checking out, seeing what comments we have already. CJ, already in the comment section, CJ Mays is sharing, I seriously considered going to rabbinical school at Ziegler in 2015, but I stayed in political science. Sometimes I really do wish I'd gone to rabbinical school. Academia is such a rat race. I'm not going to argue with you there. There's some rats running in the rabbi race as well. I'm not diminishing anybody, not that people are rats, but it is a journey. It is a struggle. It is a profession. And I'll say in the rabbinate, there are politics as well. If you think political science is more political than modern religion, I'll say anytime you get more than one person in a room, politics happen, and that's true in the rabbinate as well. But I will also say, if you want to study politics and also someday decide to go to rabbinical school, I am a second career rabbi, and I'll talk about that more in just a bit. And I actually selected the Ziegler School, which you mentioned. That's where I went to school, because it struck me as having the higher proportion compared to the other seminary that I was looking at of second career students, people who had tried one thing or done well for themselves in one sphere and decided at some point they wanted to be a rabbi in addition to that or instead of that. That's what I did. And Ziegler is a very good place for that. I'm just going to throw some props out to my alma mater. I get no money from the Ziegler people on this. Kathy asks, when did women start becoming rabbis? I was very surprised when I first heard of it. Sorry to be old-fashioned. That's okay, because in many spheres of the Jewish world, you don't see a lot of women as rabbis. However, this has been more and more prevalent since, I'll say, the last quarter of the 20th century. I don't have the exact dates in my mind. I think it began happening, or the conversations began happening in the 70s and 80s when women were being ordained in the Reform and conservative movements and other denominations. And even of late, there have been women ordained as rabbinical teachers there have been women ordained as rabbis. They might call it something a little bit different, but women serving in rabbinic roles in the Orthodox denominations as well. So this has been a thing more and more lately. It's spread across more and more denominations. Again, I don't know my history that well of this particular phenomenon, but I believe it began in the 70s and 80s. Trigg asks, does age override experience in becoming a rabbi? Well, that's tough to say because it's really sort of individualized. I know a lot of people who have gone to rabbinical school right out of their undergraduate education as relatively young people in their mid and late 20s. And of course, the primary criteria is learning an awful lot of Torah so that you could teach Torah and Mishnah and Talmud and Jewish law and other things to people. But certainly life experience and age does help. I'll say I feel like I had a bit of an advantage being a fully grown adult at that point. I was in my mid-30s when I started rabbinical school, pushing 40 when I graduated, and I believe that maturity and life experience, such as, I can call myself mature today. Whoop, whoop, boop, boop, boop. Maybe not. But I think having had that life experience really informed my studies, gave me a firmer grasp on what it was I was learning than had I done it as a younger person. Not knocking any younger people out there in the rabbinate. Some great rabbis start off very young. But I know that age and experience certainly helped me. Good to see Andrew and Miriam have joined us as well. Welcome, y'all. Edith is joining us from New York City. Nice to see you. Nice to see you, Edith. And Miriam from New Hampshire is pointing out that Rebbi Akiva was 40. And Rebbi Akiva wasn't just 40 when he became a rabbi. This is one of my personal heroes, and I'll say a little bit about this guy. Rebbi Akiva, one of the renowned rabbis from the Mishnaic period who appears a lot in the Mishnah and the Talmud. Again, my personal hero because not only was because he wasn't 40 when he became a rabbi, he was 40 when he learned how to read. Rebbi Akiva, or as he was known before he was a rabbi, Akiva ben Yosef, was a shepherd. He was just a sheep herder working for somebody else, just working for somebody else's flock management system, as you might call it these days. But he fell in love with the boss's daughter. And she said to him, "Look, my father is never going to let me marry you unless you are a wealthy landowner or merchant. You have your own security, or you are a famous scholar." And both of these seemed completely unreachable to our friend Akiva ben Yosef, until one day he was looking for a lost sheep, and he wandered into a cave. I believe this is from the Pirkei de Rebbi Natan, if I'm not mistaken, this particular medieval work of Midrash. And it says he wandered into a cave, and he saw this flat rock in the cave. I don't know if anybody here has been to a cave and seen various rock formations, but he saw this sort of flat table of rock that had a hole born through it, right? There was a table of rock, little hole in the middle, and he looked up, and there was a stalactite. Is it a mite or a tite? There was, that little hanging, icicle of rock hanging down, dripping water, and the water was falling through this hole in the flat rock. And Rebbi Akiva, again, totally illiterate at this point, but was experienced with the ways of nature, had been in caves before, and he understood that this dripping water, this slowly drip, drip, drip of water, had worn a hole through the flat rock. And he said to himself in that moment, if water, which is soft, can wear a hole through rock, which is hard, surely the words of Torah, which are as strong as iron, can penetrate my heart made of flesh and blood. And in that moment, he said, maybe I won't become a wealthy merchant, but I will become a scholar. And again, he said this from a place of not even knowing his aleph from his bet, right? Not knowing A from B. But what did he do? The next day, he sat down in kindergarten. That's how the story goes. He sat down, if you can imagine this big burly shepherd, big sheepskin coat smelling like the sheep's, sitting down in a tiny chair among all these little kids, and he learned their aleph and bet, the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And it says from there he learned aleph to taf, the whole alphabet. And from there, having learned the whole alphabet, he began to learn the words of the Torah. And then he learned the entire Torah. And then he learned the entirety of the oral Torah as well, an oral tradition that sort of predates and then later became the Mishnah, and then became one of the greatest scholars we ever had. And some say by the time he died, he had accumulated, depending on the version of the story, either 12,000 or 24,000 students over the course of a lifetime of scholarship that didn't get started until he was 40 years old. So, again, this is my personal hero in the rabbinate. I started this journey when I was into my 30s already, let's say, and I figure, okay, if this illiterate shepherd can start learning at the age of 40 and do as well for himself as he did, certainly a financial analyst who was about 33 years old. I could read already. I was pretty good at math. Oh, it doesn't come into play that much, but you'd be surprised. Certainly somebody with a college education with 10 years of experience in a career and lots of experience working with people, working for a living, could come into this and learn enough to do okay, right? And that's really, I didn't want 12,000 or 24,000 students. I have lots of students. I have more students right now than I have ever imagined having. But surely if Rebbi Akiva can start off at 40, then I could start off at, I want to say about 33, maybe, when I started this journey. Then I might do okay. And so that's why I follow the lead of Rebbi Akiva, who, not only started late and then amassed this great following, but is one of the most frequently quoted rabbis in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, right? He was revered not only by his students, but by his colleagues as well. And we study his teachings today. So let me just wet my whistle a little bit. And so let me tell you a little bit about my Rebbi Akiva story, if you will. I talked in a previous session about my journey to becoming Jewish. This happened when I was about 25 years old. I think I started studying when I was 24, and then the summer, maybe 23, the summer of 2000, I would have been almost 25, and that's when I became Jewish. And I was Jewish for a few years, and just normal Jewish person. I probably went to synagogue more than average. Like, I liked going to synagogue. I liked learning about Jewish traditions. I learned to lead part of the service. I learned to read from the Torah in public. But when I say learn, I was more like memorizing tapes and stuff before I got up and gave Torah readings. So I wasn't learning for comprehension or the tropes or things like that, but I was beginning to take a role in participating in services and things like that. We moved a couple of times. There were a few life events intervening there. We moved a couple of times. We moved from Knoxville to Minneapolis. Another life event that happened was that my wife and I separated and eventually divorced. And so this was the wife that I had married in the previous story. We got married pretty young. Just things happen, and we separated. And so after we separated, people were curious, like, was I going to keep being Jewish, right? They thought maybe from the outside, it looked like maybe I had converted for her or for her family. And now that I wasn't a part of a nuclear Jewish family anymore, I mean, we still had our kids together, and still, partial custody, that whole thing. So I still saw my kids every week. They were still going to Jewish day schools and things like that. But people were seriously wondering, like, whether I would keep doing Jewish things. And that was a part of me, but that was a part of my life that I did not separate from. It's actually something that I clung to in a time of real, and I'll say painful, change in my life. In fact, I like to think that one of the things that kept me being Jewish, or kept me involved in the Jewish community, was that first Passover after my separation. There was a friend of mine that I knew from the synagogue. I was still going on almost a weekly basis. Sometimes I even went to the daily morning minyan on weekdays. And my friend Sid knew that this was the first Passover that I was going to be apart from my family, and that I may not have a place to go. And so he said, "Why don't you come to my place?" And so I went to Sid's, by myself for Passover. And it wasn't really by myself. There were like a bunch of people. There were like a dozen or 2 dozen people there. But Sid knew that I didn't have a place to go vis-a-vis being with my family on Passover, and my extended family, not Jewish at all. And so he asked me to come to his place for Passover, and I did. And I like to think that that's something that really kept me connected to the Jewish community. And then a year after that, I was dating somebody. I'd met another young woman, and we were getting serious. And I thought, okay, well, let's see how she likes this Jewish aspect of my life. And I brought her as my date to Sid's house for Passover the following year. And she went along with it. This was a person I was dating, was not Jewish, right? Had never experienced the Passover Seder until she experienced this very traditional Passover Seder that took, 4 to 6 hours, and did the full Monty, look for the Afikomen and all that stuff, and sat around singing and praying for a couple hours after dinner. And so this was her introduction to Jewish life, just as a Passover Seder had been my introduction to Jewish life when I was dating my first wife. And then I think either the year after that, I'm losing my math a little bit here, maybe a year or so after that, I brought her to Sid's house to the Seder as my wife. But before we got married, we'd been dating for a couple years. We're getting pretty serious. I was still kind of on the fence whether I wanted to get married again. I'll just admit that, because if anybody out there watching this has been divorced, you may know that jumping right back into marriage isn't like high on your list of priorities. As one of my divorced friends who has since remarried said before she remarried, marriage is an institution. And I prefer to stay out of those. So people are a little bit nervous to get married again the second time. However, to this day, I stick by a quote that I believe is from Mark Twain, which is, second marriages are the triumph of hope over experience. And so that has certainly been my experience as well. So anyway, when we're getting serious, I said to her the same thing that my first wife had said to me. I can't expect you to convert. That's a very personal choice, and it's not a condition of us getting married. However, I have 2 Jewish children who I'm raising as Jews, and if we have children, I'd like to raise them as Jews as well, and I would really like it if you would at least consider taking a class about Judaism, like the Intro to Judaism class that people take when they're planning to convert, but no expectations there. So she started taking the class, and I went to class with her. I figured, she was taking this class for me. It was the least thing I could do would be to show up and go to the class with her. And along the way, a couple of things happened. First off, after taking the class, she decided to convert. That wasn't necessarily my expectation, but that's what happened, and she did. And when we got married, she was already Jewish. And so we had a rabbi marry us in a synagogue, and it was awesome. And the other thing that happened was I had been, let's say, a consultant in financial analysis and computer systems, roughly speaking, for about 10 years. And so just studied economics in college, got good programming databases and spreadsheet macros and things like that. So I did various consulting jobs, essentially doing math for a living for law firms and banks and marketing companies and things like that. So I was a numbers guy, professionally speaking. While I was sitting in on the Intro to Judaism class with my fiance, things started to, I'll say, reignite for me at the same time that I was getting, I'll admit it, bored with my career. I'd been, again, crunching numbers for a living, made decent money, made other people much more money. I felt like I was paying the bills, I was taking care of my family, but it wasn't the satisfying life mission that I was looking for. And so I thought about a number of different things, and what might I do? I tried stand-up comedy for a little while. If you know me, you know that this isn't too far off the mark. I love humor. I use humor in my teaching, and I was actually an open micer, or an open mic stand-up, meaning almost entirely unpaid, working in bars on weeknights while I had a job at a mortgage bank. So I tried stand-up comedy. I thought about cooking school because I love to cook. And then I researched, what it took to become a chef. And it was mostly very reading blogs and things. It was mostly very angry people, underpaid, with knives. And I thought that might not be a good career pursuit for me. But I read Richard Bowles' What Color is Your Parachute? And it asked things like, okay, what do you enjoy doing? What are you good at? What settings do you enjoy working in? And I started thinking about that. Well, I love to learn, and I love to teach, and I love being in synagogues, and I love being a part of the Jewish community. And then ultimately, I asked myself, and this is a little bit of advice, if you're thinking about changing careers or picking a career for the first time, here's the tool that I use. I call it the Powerball question. If you're familiar with Powerball or Mega Millions, like these big lottery jackpots and things like that. And so what I asked myself, if I won Powerball, right, one of these, $100 million, now it's getting into $1 billion and crazy stuff like that. And not that I even buy tickets, but okay, sometimes I buy tickets when the jackpot gets high enough. I know it's gambling, but it's entertainment, whatever. But I thought, okay, what if I had suddenly $100 million fall into my lap, which is kind of a proxy question for what would you do if you could do anything with no risk, right? You didn't have to worry about paying the bills, taking care of your family, anything like that. All other things were sort of taken care of. What would you do? And I thought, well, I would probably like have a massive party for like 3 months. Like, this is just to be perfectly honest with you. I would buy an island. I would have a party on that island. I would endow universities, buy houses for my family, all this different stuff. But then I figured, okay, after that massive party and spree, I would wake up with a tremendous hangover one day, be bored of all the luxury, and I asked myself, what would I do on that day, right? Once I had sort of done all the fantasy stuff and I just really needed to do something that gave my life meaning and had no risk of failure, what would I do on that day? And thinking about that, I decided, I'd probably, guiltily maybe spend more time at shul. I would like to devote myself to Jewish study. Again, this is when I'm taking the Intro to Judaism class with my fiance, really having that reignited for me in terms of curiosity and interest and wanting to get deep into Torah and Mishnah and Talmud and things like that. So one day I'm sitting in shul, I'm thinking about this Powerball answer, and I thought, okay, what do I really like to do? I like to learn. I like to teach. I like making an ass of myself in public, frankly. And if you've watched any of my YouTube videos, you know that that's true. And I like spending time in synagogues. I like being engaged in Jewish community. And then I looked up. And again, I was sitting in the synagogue. I looked up, and on the beam, I see my rabbi. And I'm like, wait a minute. He's got that job. Right? There's another thing I wanted to do. I want to learn another language, maybe study in a foreign country. I'd never been able to do that as a kid. And I thought, well, that's his job. He learns and he teaches, and he gets to make a fool of himself in public from time to time, especially in the Purim spiel. And he was a very humorous rabbi in how he delivered his sermons sometimes. And he got to study in Israel and learn Hebrew and I didn't know then Aramaic and probably some other stuff as well. And I thought, he's got my Powerball job, right? He's doing the thing that I would do if I could do anything in the world. And this was a Saturday morning. And again, I had tried on a number of different careers. The stand-up thing lasted for about 6 months until I realized, like, I can't be telling jokes in bars on Wednesday and showing up at 8:30 for my mortgage bank job the next day. I wasn't ready to commit to cooking school. So I tried a lot of things. And so when I thought, maybe I'll be a rabbi, I didn't trust that either, right? I didn't think that it was remotely a possibility for me at age, I guess, 32, 33, something like that. But I kept thinking about it. And, and I didn't want to really share it with my spouse. We'd gotten married since then. We'd been married about 6 months at this point. And I thought, man, she is going to plots. If you know what I'm saying in Yiddish, I probably just lost my my clean lyric sticker. She is going to be nonplussed when I share this with her. And so I kept quiet. But all that night I couldn't sleep. I just kept turning it over in my head. What would it mean for me to, at this stage in my life, in my mid-30s, go to rabbinical school and become a rabbi and have that as a career? And could I even do it? Like, was I eligible, right? And I didn't know any other rabbis like me. And I couldn't sleep all night. And the next morning we woke up. Our custom back then, before we had kids, was we'd go for a jog every Sunday morning together. My wife still takes a run every Sunday morning. I don't. I stay with the kids, although I'd like to get back into it maybe when they're a little older. But we went for a jog. And this was Minneapolis in February, and our customary jogging path was around a lake. So Minneapolis in February, the lake is frozen solid, and we're all bundled up with like scarves and earmuffs and gloves while we're running. And we're out going for a jog, and we're about 1.5 miles into a 3-mile run. And usually we chatter, we just talk the whole time, make plans for the week or whatnot. But I can't think of anything to talk about except wanting to consider being a rabbi. And so I kept quiet until about halfway through. She's like, "Why are you so quiet?" And I said, "I think I want to go to seminary and become a rabbi." just being, I guess, prepared for any reaction on her part. And she stopped dead in her tracks. Like we've been jogging at probably a pretty good clip, and she just stopped dead. And she says, "John, that sounds insane, but it also sounds like you." Right? She knew me pretty well at this point. And she says, "This sounds like you. And if this is something you're going to do, no half measures. You need to go all in, right? Pursue it with everything you've got. And if you do, I'm behind you 100%." And I had no reason whatsoever to expect that reaction on her part. I don't know a lot of rabbis who become rabbis 6 months into a new marriage, or rather make that kind of huge career change and announce it to their spouse, or a lot of spouses who would go along with that sort of thing. But she did, and she has, and I wouldn't be the rabbi I am had I not had her full support the whole time. And I shared this earlier in my story about becoming Jewish, and I mentioned that what I didn't know when I became Jewish, I want to say about 8 years before that, what I didn't know was that my parents weren't crazy about the idea of me becoming Jewish. They felt really hurt and rejected not because I rejected them, but because I rejected a path that was very important to them. And they waited years they sort of nursed that, and they told me only way later that they weren't crazy about me being Jewish. Those are the words we're not crazy about you being Jewish. But here I was contemplating doubling down, as it were, and becoming a rabbi. Before I talked to my parents, though, I wanted to talk to my rabbi. Later on that week, I made an appointment with him, saw him in his office, and he's like, "So, John, what do you want to talk about?" And I said, "How do you like your job?" And he knew that I had been searching. Like one of the things that I had been actively considering, in addition to comedy and being a chef, I had thought seriously about joining the service, about signing up with the Army as a 30-some-year-old man. Found out that, yes, I could get waivers and it was possible. Had actually come very close to joining the Army. I was literally in the office about to put pen to paper when I remembered that my wife made it very clear to me that she did not want to be an Army spouse. That's not how she saw her future or our future playing out. And I thought, okay, I can't let this one get away, and decided not to become a soldier. And she'd also enlisted my rabbi at that time, like, "Could you talk some sense into John?" So my rabbi was aware that I was looking for an alternative career. And when I came to him and I said, "How do you like your job?" he said, "I've been waiting for you to ask me that. And here's a pamphlet." he actually went into his desk and pulled out, a folder that had some pamphlets or flyers from different rabbinical schools. And, of course, his alma mater was Jewish Theological Seminary, which is a seminary of the conservative Jewish movement in Manhattan. That's where he went. But he also recommended looking at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, which was a newer program in Los Angeles. And another program, Hebrew College in Boston, has a rabbinical program. Wasn't really interested in being an Orthodox rabbi necessarily, and not that they'd probably take me anyway because I didn't have an Orthodox conversion. And I never really thought about the Reform movement very much, just because I hadn't had a lot of experience with the Reform movement. Later on, when I began to talk to rabbis at rabbinical schools, they asked me, like, "How do you know you're a conservative Jew? You're not an Orthodox Jew or Reform Jew?" And that led me to do lots of research on, all I was familiar with was the conservative Jewish world. But then I dug deep on, okay, what do Orthodox Jews believe? What do Orthodox rabbis teach? What do Reform Jews believe? What do Reform rabbis teach? And I looked at the whole spectrum and decided that I felt most at home in the conservative Jewish world, not just socially and culturally, but philosophically and theologically as well. And so I applied to Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles. But shortly after applying, I decided I had a phone call to make. And I knew that, God willing, I got into school, I was going to be moving out of Minneapolis, which is where we were living. And because my parents would say, "Hey, why does your address change to New York or your address change to Los Angeles?" And so I thought I'm going to need to tell my parents that I've decided I want to become a rabbi. And knowing how they felt the last time we discussed my Jewishness, I thought this could legit be the last time I ever talked to them. Like, I thought they might disown me or never want to hear from me again. Just that would be like the last nail in the coffin of our relationship. And so I picked up the phone one afternoon, called my dad, and said, "Dad, I want to go to seminary and become a rabbi." And he said, "That's wonderful. Wait till I tell your mother. That's such great news." And I couldn't have been more surprised by that reaction. What I didn't share before is that my father had been in academia, but before that, his first career was as a Southern Baptist minister. Not only that, he was the third generation in his family to be a minister of some sort. And so here I was, the fourth generation, talking about going back into the family business, right? Maybe in a different franchise, or it's sort of Burger King, McDonald's, or maybe not with the cheeseburgers in this one, but in any case, he saw me kind of following this family tradition, and he knew by that point that this wasn't just like a flash in the pan thing that I did to spurn them or to spite them. This was something that gave my life meaning, and he knew that I was looking for a career that would help me help other people, to serve in some capacity, and connect to something greater than myself. And he saw this as a path for that and was thus very happy for me. And my mom was happy for me as well. And so that, further bolstered, I went through the process, and it was about a year-long process of, talking to rabbis at seminaries. That you can't just download a form. You have to talk to a person first, because they want to make sure that you're sincere and not insane and knows exactly how much work it's going to be. And so you talk to somebody, they'll send you an application, you begin this process. One place I called, actually, the person actively discouraged me from applying. Refused to send me an application because in that person's mind, I didn't have the right background that I could be successful in rabbinical school. That particular rabbinical school mostly took people who were Jewish studies majors in college and had grown up going to Hebrew school and confirmation class and went to Jewish summer camps and studied in Israel in their gap year and were very thoroughly well steeped in the Jewish world before they went to rabbinical school. He said, tell you what, why don't you go study in Israel for a year and then call me back after that? And I was like, I'm a grown man. I'm not some kid who can just take off. I've got 2 kids and another one on the way at this point. I can't just drop everything in order to maybe someday apply. It was going to be enough to drop everything and go to rabbinical school. I couldn't drop everything in order for the chance to apply to rabbinical school. So luckily, another person took his role and called me back and encouraged me to apply, and I did. So in any case, I applied to a school in New York. I applied to a school in LA. I visited both. I got accepted to both, and had one of the hardest decisions I have ever had to make, right? Fact was, I knew about New York City. I'd lived in New York City briefly. I had a lot of friends in New York City. I was very excited about the prospect of living in New York City, although my wife was less excited about that prospect, just as it's a tough place to raise kids, expense-wise. But I was really excited about New York City. And that school had sort of a reputation of longer standing. And most rabbis in the conservative world graduated from that school, right? The Ziegler School was a bit of a newer school. They'd only been, they had been kind of how do I say this? Like a farm team in a way. Like people would go there for a couple of years and then study for a year in Israel and then finish their studies in New York. But a few years before, the Ziegler School became a complete program where people could go, beginning to end in Los Angeles. With a break studying in Israel. And so on the one hand, I had sort of the safe choice, the school that most people went to and that nobody would question my judgment for going to. And on the other hand, I had sort of the newer school, and it was a little bit like Mac and PC, right? It was a little bit like, not Coke and Pepsi so much, it was a little bit like the safe choice and the newer choice. PC and Mac. If you remember those commercials with Justin Long. From my consulting background, I remember the phrase, nobody ever got fired for buying Microsoft, or nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, right? Nobody ever got harmed by making the safe choice. But I also visited the school in LA, and I found that I really liked the people that I met there, and I really liked the professors that were there. And most compelling to me was I saw a higher proportion of second career rabbis, like people who had other jobs and came in later in life, and a higher proportion of people who had kids. And I already had little kids at that point. So I decided, and the one thing that really clutched it for me, and this was down to the wire, I had to make my choice on April 1st. I remember it was April Fool's Day. It was a Monday. And the weekend before that, it was Friday afternoon. I was at a local public library in Minneapolis, and like with a really small Jewish section, if you can imagine, just like one stack of books. And I thought, I'm just going to grab a Jewish book to read over Shabbat. And so I grabbed a book off the shelf, didn't even open the flap to see what it was about, checked it out, took it home, and it was called The Holy Thief by a rabbi named Rabbi Mark Borovitz. And I open up the first page, and it says something like, it's 5 a.m. I've already had 2 espressos and half a pack of cigarettes. I'm really, really nervous because today is the day that I am ordained by the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. And at that point, I said, come on, God, that is just not fair. Like, I just opened this book like it was there written for me. I grabbed this at random, opened it up, and read this story of somebody who was ordained by the Ziegler School. And Rabbi Mark Borovitz is sort of the spiritual head of a place called Beit Tshuva, which is a residential addiction recovery place with, Jewish values and Jewish curricula imbued in it here in Los Angeles. And Rabbi Borovitz shares his story of having kind of a rough childhood. Father died when he was a young age. He got in with the wrong crowd, had gotten into crime and addiction and things like that. And during his second stint in prison, decided that he was going to turn his life around, devote his life to Jewish study, took what he had learned to a halfway house that he was volunteering and then working at, and he was teaching Talmud to other addicts. And then when the Ziegler School began ordaining people, a rabbi friend of his says, why don't you go? You're already a rabbi to these people. Why don't you make it official and become a rabbi? And so this is a little bit goes back to my Rebbi Akiva story, not my Rebbi Akiva story, it's Rebbi Akiva's story, but this guy had a late start in a very rough life and became a rabbi and went and turned around and helped a lot of people. And I thought in that moment, okay, if this school can take this guy and help him become a rabbi, I should be a piece of cake. And not to diminish Rabbi Borovitz, for whom I have worlds of respect, but like if he can become a rabbi and that school is the school that helped him, then this is where I want to be. And so I did. I went to the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. When I got there, they tested me, like my Hebrew level, just to back up a little bit. If you want to go to rabbinical school these days, it helps. In fact, they sort of insist that you have some facility with Hebrew. You don't have to be a fluent speaker yet, but they like you to see that you've had at least a year's worth of college level Hebrew. And I was working during the day. There was no way I could go back to school and take Hebrew classes based on like the only classes being offered at that level were at the university, and I'd have to like punch out halfway through the day to do that. Instead, I found a tutor who who taught in like a local Jewish day school. She met with me for an hour or two every Sunday, and we went through the college Hebrew textbook, and she got me to a place where I basically knew enough to apply to rabbinical school. And then I took the placement test, and they said, well, based on your scores, you're kind of on the bubble. Right, we can either put you in the 5-year track or the 6-year track. And the 5-year track was for people who had had more study than I had had. But I also had opportunity costs. By the time we got to California, our third child had arrived, and I thought, okay, I've got mouths to feed. If I can shave a year off of this, they said take the 6-year track. It'll be a little bit easier for you. And so I started off that way. But then I realized, like, I just have too much opportunity cost. I can't stay in school for 6 years if I could possibly do it in 5. And so I took on extra work. I really annoyed my deans and my advisor and my teacher saying, okay, what extra work would I have to do to catch up and finish in 5 instead of 6? And they said, nobody's ever done that before. But I said, just play with me. They're like, what would I have to do to make this happen? And they said, okay. They thought they'd put a bunch of hurdles in front of me that I would get scared off. And then I jumped over those hurdles. And then I finished rabbinical school, I'll say by the skin of my teeth in 5 years, because again, I was sort of coming from behind and playing catch up the whole way through. But through the partnership of my fellow students and incredible teachers and patient rabbis, I became a rabbi after 5 years. And this was back in 5774 or 2014 by the Gregorian calendar. And I would never choose anything else at this point. This has been probably one of the greatest decisions I've ever made in my life. And so that's how I became a rabbi. And would love to see what questions people have about that. If anybody else out there is considering rabbinical school as well. Again, it's not for everybody. So, but it is possible. And one of the things that I learned early on, actually when I first had that conversation with my own personal rabbi in Minneapolis about maybe going to rabbinical school, he said before I even asked it, is like, I'll answer your first question right now, which is, yes, somebody who converted to Judaism can be a rabbi, right? You do have to be Jewish to be a rabbi, but once you convert, you're just as Jewish as every other born Jew out there. And so he says, yes, a convert can become a rabbi. Have I experienced occasional static because I didn't grow up the same way everybody else did? Of course I have. I'd be totally dishonest to say, oh, it was a piece of cake. Rabbis have the same experience, or converts have the same experience in rabbinical school as everybody else. That is absolutely not true. But what I did learn was that at both of the schools that I applied to, there's like 1 or 2 converts in every single graduating class. And so I wasn't a trailblazer in that regard by any stretch of the imagination. It was probably different for me because I didn't have the same life experience or growing up experience, but I wasn't that odd. I was probably more odd because I was an older guy with a family compared to mostly younger single students who started with me. So I'm just going to jump into the chat to see if people have questions. Great to see you, Ruthie. So glad you're here. So sorry, just going to pause. It's going to be quiet, bad radio here for a second, but I've been talking for a long time and I just want to go into the chat to see what's up. Boop, 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 boo, a little hold music. This is why I know I've succeeded as a parent. Yesterday I heard my daughter humming Girl from Ipanema, which is one of my favorite songs. I don't know if I have any bossa nova fans out there. Kathy says, great story means there's hope for us, LOL. Okay. If anybody out there really wants to think about this kind of career path, please reach out to me. Again, I'll say it's not for everybody. It took a lot of work, and I'm not trying to brag about it, but it did take a fair amount of work and sacrifice. I was a full-time student for 5 years, sort of scraping by between student loans and some scholarships, but also working while I was taking an 18-hour credit load. So if that's something that doesn't scare you off, please reach out to me, and I'm happy to give you a pamphlet like my rabbi did for me. Miriam asks, how much Hebrew do you have to know before getting accepted into seminary, or do you learn Hebrew then? So I will say the standard for seminaries in the liberal movements, in my experience, is that you should have at least a year's worth, or what's called a year's worth of college level Hebrew, like 2 semesters of college level Hebrew. I kind of took the skunkworks approach and worked with a private tutor to get to that level, barely. If you can study in a school program, that's great. They might have some things in Los Angeles and New York. It's really hard to find in other places. But you do need to have like a certain level of Hebrew beyond just, the Aleph Beit. And when I visited the Ziegler School, which is where I wound up going, I asked people, what was your biggest surprise upon entering rabbinical school? And almost to a person, they were surprised by how much Hebrew there was. And these were people who, grew up Jewish, going to synagogues, probably knew way more rabbis than I did, but were surprised at exactly how much of the work is done in Hebrew. And I remember that first year, this one person said to me, everybody here is pretty smart, right? You don't get to go if you haven't achieved some level of academic and possibly professional success. And so this is a bunch of bright people, but even for bright people, it feels like starting a PhD program with a 3rd grade reading level, right? Because even if you have a fair amount of college level Hebrew, once you jump into the study, immediately you're taking one class in modern conversational Israeli Hebrew, probably with an Israeli teacher, just to get you used to speaking Hebrew as best you can. Then you're taking a class in the Tanakh, which is biblical Hebrew. So you're taking modern Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. You're taking a class in Mishnah. And so that's a different era of Hebrew. So, imagine you grew up not speaking English, and then you went to a graduate program, which most of the material that you're learning from is in English, not your first language. But it's not just in English. You're reading, let's say, Hemingway and Shakespeare and Chaucer, or maybe even Beowulf in like Old English or Middle English at the same time, because you're learning in biblical era Hebrew, you're learning in Mishnaic era Hebrew, which is about 1,000, 1,500 years later in the evolution of the language, and you're learning in modern Hebrew as well, which is things like, okay, how do I order at a restaurant? How do I find the bathroom at the bus station? That kind of stuff. So you're learning Hebrew intensively all day long in different aspects of Hebrew. So even if you know some Hebrew going in, it is a challenge, and it is not for everybody. And many people do it for a year and said, that's not what I thought I was going to get into. And so that can be daunting. However, it's once you start getting the hang of it, then you can really get to do some really interesting learning once you have a handle on the text. And everybody starts off, as this person said to me, everybody starts off, even if they're super bright, even if they've taken years of Hebrew in college, they've still got a lot to learn once they get started in rabbinical school. So let's see what other questions people have. Kathy asks, what is the educational background of lay people who teach in synagogues and temples? I will say from my experience that lay people who teach in synagogues have backgrounds that are all over the map. Some of them were Jewish studies majors or scholars of rabbinic literature, didn't become rabbis for whatever reason, but maybe had studied as a child, maybe had studied in Orthodox yeshiva back in the day, but then became doctors, and then they came back to, while they're doctors, they teach Hebrew school and things like that. So you will find people of all different kinds of learning, whether they focus their academic studies on Jewish things or just picked that up as a kid or studied it throughout their life as sort of a hobby and then came back to teach. But they may be doctors, lawyers, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, the whole thing. So you get people from lots of different backgrounds because, this was, and I'll say somewhat advisedly, something that I learned that I was surprised by was that the rabbis of the Talmud were not professional rabbis. Like, this wasn't a job 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, right? The rabbis that we read about in the Mishnah and the Talmud, they all had day jobs, right? There were various rabbis who were butchers, who were beer brewers. Rashi, his day job was making and distributing wine, and then at night he wrote an incredible gloss on all of the Tanakh and most of the Talmud. And so this was something that people studied in their spare time while they had a farm or while they had a business or some sort of livelihood, right? This historically has been a hobby. It's only been in the last 100 or 200 years that it's become professionalized in much the same way that Christian clergy became professionalized, that this became something that you could do for a living. And so I would encourage people, like, you don't have to go to rabbinical school to study Jewish stuff. Many people, in fact, that's part of the screening process, is they ask you, like, do you actually want to be a rabbi, or do you just want to do the study that rabbis study? And the hard thing is that outside of the Orthodox world, it's very difficult to find advanced Jewish study, right? You can take a class in the Tanakh with your rabbi at a synagogue, but there's not a lot of like deep study of basic Mishnah or Talmud or things like that outside of the Orthodox world. In the Orthodox world, you can find all sorts of opportunities to study Mishnah, Talmud, Halakha, Jewish law, Midrash, but outside of that world, it's hard to find high-level, deep Jewish study. And so many people in the liberal world wind up going to rabbinical school just because they want to be able to learn Talmud, and it's not being taught anyplace else. And so, once you get there and you start learning it, they're like, okay, are you just here to learn the Talmud, or you actually want to be a rabbi and teach this to other people in the future? That's a question. Let's see. What are the questions people have? Glad you could join us today, Curtis. Kathy shares, what color is your parachute? That's a book that I mentioned earlier by Richard Bowles. She said, but try to get the oldest edition. I'll say another aspect of reading that book that was very helpful to me is that Richard Bowles was a pastor at one point in his life. And I don't know if that ever washes off if he ever stopped being a pastor, but he was a Christian clergy person. And there was this extra chapter in the back of the book, and I read through the whole thing cover to cover, and then I get to this extra chapter at the back, and he said, here's a special section for religious people, right? People who, people of faith, because everything else in the book is very practical. Anybody can use this stuff to figure out what their right career path is. But this chapter at the end said, okay, if you are a person of faith, here is another perspective for you. One thing when we're picking a career, we try to figure out, okay, what's the right thing for us? If you're a person of faith, you may also be asking the question, what does God want for me? Like, what is God's plan for me? And, not everybody asks this question, but I was, getting to be a more and more religious person by this point. And he says, okay, if you're looking for a sign, then those other things we talked about in the book, what are you good at? What do you like to do? What settings do you enjoy spending your time in? Isn't it possible that these are signs, right? If you are good at something, isn't it possible that is a gift from God designed to point you in the right direction, right? If there's something people compliment you on that maybe you don't have fun doing it, but you don't even see it as a strength, but somebody says, oh, you're a good speaker, or you're a good organizer, or you're a good writer. When people tell you those things, could that not be a sign that that's something you are meant to do if you believe that God has a plan for you? And so he said, just, go back over this and say, these various indications of what makes me happy or what I am good at and makes other people happy. Think of those as signs. And that was actually really helpful for me because that was something I was struggling with. Like, does God want me to be a financial analyst? Does God want me to program databases for a marketing company? It's not fun. I'm good at it, but I'm not enjoying it as much as I thought I would. But I do enjoy spending time in synagogues. I do enjoy learning and teaching, and have had some success in that. Maybe those were signs that this was the right thing for me. And so I took that as Bowles was dishing it out. Let's see. Looking for more questions in this. We've been going for about an hour now, so I don't want to bend your ear for too long. Just see what other questions there are. Uh, do do do. Susan asks a question. I am curious. At my conservative shul, where shul is a Yiddish word for synagogue, if people aren't hip to it, most of the leading of prayers aren't done by the rabbi. Was it the same with you? Did you mostly just do a drasha, which means like a sermon or a talk about the Torah? And this varies from place to place. Again, most of my experience with synagogues before I went to rabbinical school was in large suburban synagogues where there were multiple volunteers who would lead services as well. Like you're mentioning, one place I went to had two full-time cantors, right? So they always had a professional prayer leader leading the services, and then the rabbi would get up to give a drasha or a sermon during the services. And this was in like the main sanctuary Saturday morning. Sometimes on weekday minions, the rabbi might lead the services as well. That is, like, be the prayer leader, the shliach tzibor. But it really varies in place to place and how big the communities are. When I became a rabbi for the first time, I didn't become a rabbi multiple times. Okay, let me change this. When I was completing rabbinical school, I went into the search process, interviewed at a number of different synagogues, and thankfully wound up at the beautiful, wonderful, warm, friendly Burbank Temple Emmanuel in beautiful downtown Burbank, California. And it's a relatively small community. Did not have a lot of volunteers that could lead services. There were a few, but they really looked to their rabbi to lead the services. And this was something that I was less experienced with. We learn how to lead services during rabbinical school. Many people already know how to lead services when they start. I did not. I learned the hard way, just from zero. Like, I was able to lead the Torah service from back in the day before, but that was it. That's sort of the easiest, in my opinion, service to learn how to lead. But I didn't know how to lead an entire 2.5 hour service by myself. But I had to learn quickly, because once I came to the synagogue that I started at, there wasn't another person who could lead the entire service. It was on me. And so I had learned well enough that I could get through it, page 10 to 514 in 2.5 hours flat. I got better over time. People would give me advice and occasional critique, and just through practice got better and better at it. But at that particular synagogue, again, about 100 families total, which is pretty small as suburban synagogues go. 10 to 15, maybe 20 people there on a Saturday morning. I would lead the entirety of the service from the beginning at 9:30 till the end at about 12. Later on, I found people who could lead the Torah service, and they learned how to do that. So we had some volunteers, but it really depends on the size of the community, the depth of the bench, I'll say. It's not typical one way or the other, but the larger the synagogue, the more volunteers they have that know how to lead services, and then the rabbi maybe just gives the sermon. And then larger synagogues still might, in addition to having a rabbi, if, not every synagogue has a rabbi for one thing, but in a larger synagogue, they may not just have competent lay leaders, but also maybe a professional cantor. Where I do most of my teaching these days in Pasadena, there is a wonderful cantor there who does most of the singing as far as leading services goes. And there are very skilled volunteers as well, leading the Torah service, reading Torah, reading the Haftarah, things like that. And then I'm there basically to give the drasha, as Susan shares, meaning give a brief sermon, 10, sometimes I push 15 minutes, 20 if I'm feeling salty. But so I'm there to give the sermon. I'm also really good at calling out page numbers. So that's a little joke for rabbis that, if you've got a cantor there, the rabbi's really just there to call out page numbers to let everybody know what page the cantor is on. So it really varies from place to place. and it's not typical one way or the other. But yeah, I think the main thing to remember is there is nothing in Jewish ritual life almost that requires a rabbi. A rabbi is a very different thing from, say, a Catholic priest. And most people's exposure in popular culture, at least in America and things like that, if you're not familiar with the ins and outs of theology of the different faiths, like your exposure to religious leadership is through movies, TV, whatnot, is like the Catholic priest. This guy it's always a guy for one thing, stands up front. And in Catholicism, again, I'm not an expert in this, but my basic understanding of Catholicism is that many sacraments, what we would call mitzvot, or holy activities that we're required to do, require the participation of a priest as an intercessory figure between the congregant and God, right? There are things that you can't do if the priest isn't there to do them for you or with you. And many people who are less familiar with Jewish tradition, including Jewish people, think, well, I can't make Kiddush. I need the rabbi to do that. Or if the rabbi's here, the rabbi should make Kiddush. Or, hey, where's the rabbi? We need to say the motzi, the blessing over the bread. And I always love to bust that myth. Like, you don't have to be a rabbi to make Kiddush, to make motzi, to lead services, to give a drasha. Like, you don't have to be a rabbi to give a sermon. It's just a rabbi isn't a magical intercessory figure. We don't have any holier status than any other Jewish person. The only times that you really need a rabbi is for a Beit Din. And then, even then, there are some dayanim. So a Beit Din, to spell it out for people, is a court of 3 judges that is required for certain, let's say, Jewish civic activity, like a conversion or a Jewish divorce or a other kind of activities, like you might, or to settle a matter in Jewish law, you might need a Beit Din, which is usually 3 rabbis. And the only thing that distinguishes a rabbi really is that a person who has studied enough Torah that other rabbis say, okay, this person has studied enough Torah that they can now go and teach Torah, and we consider them a colleague as a rabbi. And so the judges on a Beit Din are usually rabbis, because those are usually the people who have studied enough to adjudicate that matter of law, or to recognize that convert, or to officiate that divorce or something like that. But I've also heard of dayanim, or judges on a Beit Din, who were not rabbis. They were just very learned. They had never received smicha, which is sort of our word for ordination. But you don't have to be. You don't even necessarily have to be a rabbi to sit on a Beit Din. And so I just want to make that really clear to people. We are very different from, let's say, a Catholic priest or some officiant that we have some kind of special connection to God. We don't. We have just studied more than your average bear. And so we can be called on to say, okay, what does the Torah say about this? Or what's the right area? Is this chicken kosher? What time should we light candles by? Things like that. But any Jewish person of sufficient learning can do any of those things, including leading services, including officiating a wedding. Now, when you're a rabbi, just by the laws of the state of California, it is easier to officiate weddings, because once you are ordained by a recognized religion, you can officiate a wedding in the state of California without having to get like a special license to do that. So it's convenient, but it's not strictly necessary. So I don't know why I got on that tear, just to say that, but all this is just to say that anything that is done in a typical Jewish service can be done by any person who knows it well enough to do it and is also Jewish, we'll say. I'm just going to share this really quick. Sometimes I have to, when people are sharing links, I have to review them. Kathy is sharing the Orthodox rapper Rabbi Nissim Black. So I highly recommend his work as well. I've seen some of his videos on YouTube, and I think it's pretty catchy. So I too will recommend Rabbi Nissim Black. Although we probably have very different theologies. He's more of a more of a Haredi rabbi than I am. Robert Pepe is asking, could I recommend a book about Rabbi Akiva? No, I cannot. I actually have a book about Rabbi Akiva that I haven't read yet. There are lots of stories about Rabbi Akiva, and I'll just say no, not that you shouldn't look for a book. There's a famous one out there, the name of which escapes me. I think perhaps As a Driven Leaf, which is not about Rebbi Akiva, but is about one of his colleagues. Also tells the story of Rebbi Akiva as well. Andrew shares, at our Orthodox synagogue, the lead rabbi spends a lot of time praying with us in the pews and less time leading the services. There's something very cool about that to me. And I am calling this out, Andrew, because there's something very cool about that to me as well. I much prefer the cheap seats, if I could say it that way, in the sense that, some rabbis thrive and really succeed as leaders from the front, meaning up on the bima, up on that little raised area. And that's what their congregation needs, and that's their customary style of leading a service. That's great for the people who connect with that and for the people for whom that brings them closer to God. My personal style is I much prefer smaller prayer settings that are sort of in the round, where if I'm leading services, I'm leading standing in the middle of the room, facing the same direction as everyone else, because I much prefer praying with people than praying on people's behalf, if that makes sense. And so, I'll lead prayers, but even when I lead prayers, my preference is to sort of standing in the middle of the room with everybody else, and we're all oriented towards the same direction. That's just personally more meaningful for me, but I've also, led from the front when that's what the community required. I see some people talking hockey about the Bruins and the Leafs. That's one of my favorite things about learning with y'all is the community that we built together, and including razzing one another about hockey. Miriam shares, most Judaism 101 books and conversion type books have a section on Rebbi Akiva, and I think that's wise. And Rebbi Akiva was born Jewish, but had a kind of a conversion story of his own. CJ asked, do rabbinical schools have enough money in the way of financial aid to help if student loans aren't an option? I've had to utilize them. So I'll say yes, but shop around in the sense of look at the different schools. Each school has their own approach to scholarships and other kinds of financial aid other than, and student loans as well, but a wide range of options. There are some schools that have very good endowments and they can pay most of the cost, and that plus getting some side work. I taught in Hebrew school. I worked in a fundraising office. I did all sorts of odd jobs, we'll say, while I was in rabbinical school that helped out quite a bit. I did take on a lot of student loans, not going to lie to you, but it is possible to get through rabbinical school, depending on the schools that you talk to, without taking on a lot of debt. So I'll just say take a look and ask around, and you will see. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up unless somebody has any more questions about the process of going to rabbinical school, getting into rabbinical school. Again, if somebody wants to have kind of a one-on-one conversation with me, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share the practical details, connect you with people who can help you on your path if this is something that you're thinking might be right for you. And I'll say some of the best rabbis that I know come from, let's say, non-traditional backgrounds. I'm going to give a shout out to my friend Rabbi Ron Goldberg, who was in the mortgage business back in, I guess, the early 90s, mid 90s, when that business was booming. And then that business was not booming, and he was out of work. The whole mortgage market after that whole Big Short, if you've seen that movie, I was actually on the side doing analysis for the banks that helped bring down the economy. Sorry, guys, I was just a cog in the machine. But at the same time, my friend Ron was a lender, was a mortgage broker, and that part of the economy dried up. And he had a successful career, and then he had everything sort of out from under him. And then so one day his wife said to him, "You can do anything in the world you want. You just can't sit on the couch anymore." And so he thought, well, I've been everything at the synagogue except the rabbi. So he'd been the president of the synagogue, the president of the men's club, on the chairs of all the committees. And so he was very familiar with synagogues and had had every job in the synagogue except for the rabbi. And so he thought, well, maybe I'll try that one. And he was in my entering class, and we were good friends and colleagues all the way through. He is now an excellent rabbi at the Jewish Home for the Aging here in Los Angeles. And even as a second career guy, they all call him a youngster because he's at a retirement home. So people come from all sorts of backgrounds. Some great rabbis from very traditional backgrounds, some great rabbis from non-traditional backgrounds as well. So if anybody out there is thinking of it, it's a tough row to hoe. It's not for everybody. When I was thinking about going to seminary, I asked one of my friends who had gone to Bible college, but then decided against becoming a pastor. And he said to me, the thing about seminary, John, is it's one of those things that you almost get more respect for dropping out of than for finishing. And I've known another of really great people, really great teachers and public servants who started out in seminary, decided it wasn't for them, and did something else. But if you want to give it a shot, give me a call or reach out to me online, and I'd love to help you out however I can. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this recording. Hero, thank you so much for listening to the Jew Curious show, and thanks again to the live studio audience who has been really supportive today, asked some great questions, and asked me to talk on this topic in the first place. If you would like to connect with Jew Curious people like this, just like you, I highly recommend you check out the Jew Curious Community Center. This is a private Facebook group that we have where people can share their stories, share their struggles, and share support with one another, and the occasional recipe as well, I found. You can find us by going to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. And before we wrap up, I just want to say that this whole production is made possible by the Jew Curious School. This is a private online learning community where our students get together. We have 3 live classes a week, but then again, all of our live classes are all of those live classes are recorded if you can't make the time when they're live. And we have students from Alaska to Southern California to Northern Florida to Cyprus and Germany and Thailand and Australia. If you can't make the live classes based on your time zone, all of our classes are recorded. We've got about 60 hours plus of recorded material in there so far. But my favorite part, of course, is the community forum where Jew Curious people just like you get together to ask questions, answer each other's questions, and I jump in there to answer questions and get silly sometimes as well with some jokes and some recipes. And I would love to learn with you in the Jew Curious School. If you're curious about whether this is right for you, check us out at jewcurious.school/info. Once again, Hero, it has been my delight to learn with you today. And until next time, Hero, and until next time, peace. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today. Kathy and Edith and Miriam and CJ. And I know we had Curtis in here as well. Grysicle, very nice to see you as well. A lot of people have joined us today. Robert, thanks for some great questions there. Karen, glad to see you. Robert Lee says hello from Toronto, Canada, or Toronto, as the case may be. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. I have some good friends from Winnipeg as well. So thanks, everybody, for hanging in for this, for really humbled that you asked me to share my story. So I hope it's been helpful for some people out there. Once again, if this is a path you're considering, feel free to reach out to me, and I will do my best to scare you off. Just kidding. It has been a life-changing good thing. It's not for everybody, but I can help you however you need if this is something you want to give it a shot. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off And tomorrow, watch the schedule. Tomorrow, an appointment has come up for me that I have to change. Instead of doing the 9 o'clock class, I might have to do our live at a different thing. So keep an eye on that. It'll probably be a little bit later in the afternoon, like maybe 1 o'clock. So keep an eye out for that. Tomorrow we will be learning the Torah portion of the week related to the intersection of Passover and Shabbat. And wish everybody a happy remainder of your Passover. And if I don't talk to you, Shabbat Shalom. But love to learn with you again sometime. And until next time, hero, peace.